Okay, right, so I'm continuing to write my book and I'm stuck again. And what I'm stuck on is if the default state in which a species is born into existence is to be with the awareness it is of the light, then how can we explain the existence of dark beings? So what I've gotten is that humanity is unique in that humanity has a capacity for spiritual dichotomy. So we can entertain the darkness as much as we can entertain the light. And this is part of the journey back to the light. So when we eventually perceive ourselves, recognize and realize ourselves as the light, we will be unique because we are a species that will have traveled through the darkness to arrive at that realization. So rather than being born into the light with no experiential appreciation of what it means, conceptually they know they are the light, but they've never experienced the dark. So without having experienced the dark, they have no perspective on what it means to be the light, to experience themselves as the light. And this is what will make humanity very unique when we eventually ascend and become non-dualistic beings completely of the light. So, in a sense, we have had an additional step. So rather than being created already with awareness of the light, we have this additional step. We have to travel through the darkness to arrive where other species are already when they very first begin their existence. Because that's the default state, to be brought into the universe as a species. Like the very first moments of a species, they are already by default aware that they are the light. So, if that's the default state, and humanity is unique in that we have this propensity or this capacity for spiritual dichotomy, then how can we explain the existence of beings that are dark? So, other information that I've got is that there are beings which came into the solar system and exploited the opportunity that we presented. So the intelligent life of the solar system are all dichotomous, spiritually dichotomous, have a capacity for spiritual dichotomy, because this is the uniqueness of our solar system. And that capacity for spiritual dichotomy meant that the species of this solar system could be exploited as vessels for darkness, like filled up with darkness. So that would imply that whoever was motivated to do that, whatever species, external, extraterrestrial, extrastellar species that came here decided to do that, then are they of the darkness? Then how is that possible if the default state is of the light? So I'm a bit confused. I'm not quite sure where to go with the book. So that's a kind of a long way of asking that question, but I just wanted to create the context so you can understand where I'm coming from. Alright, so the question is, if the default state for emergence of life in creation, or in our galaxy at least, is to be born with an awareness they are of the light, then how do we explain the existence of dark beings other than ourselves who have been born with this spiritual dichotomy? Alright, well, let's see what we got. Greetings and thank you for the question. Without going into the degree of detail you just invested to explain your question, let us just briefly say, your question is, how can the existence of dark beings be explained if the default mechanism of birthing new species into creation is to be with an awareness they are the light from the very first moments? Well, let's begin by creating some context. The diversity of beingness in creation is extraordinarily vast. There are other galaxies other than your own which, as a natural state, defy many of the laws considered to be unbreakable within your own galaxy. We make this point to illustrate that beyond your imaginings there are ways of being. So, at this point, from the perspective that you ask this question, you have a narrow perspective of the ways in which a being can be of the light. You assume that if a being is from the light, then its nature is what you would consider to be holy. That it is pure in its benevolence, its generosity, its caring, its love, and so on. However, the range is broader than this, because there is the capacity to be of the light and invested in the light, possessing a willingness to demonstrate the light, to be a beacon of the light. For the purpose of expanding the light and bringing the light to more and more, deeper and deeper, penetrating into existence, such that existence may more expediently awaken that it is the light, it is the one discovering itself through the unique perspectives in all the many ways there are to be, so that it eventually shall complete divine purpose and be completely self-realized experientially. And then, on the flip side of what we have just described, there is also the potential to be of the light and yet completely focused on your own journey, with no concern for the journey of the rest of creation, with no desire to spread the light beyond the self, because the obsession of the self is to escalate through the layers of light, through dimensional states, as a self-contained individual unit, rather than a unity which infuses you into the destinies of others, such that you then become invested in the growth and loving benevolence of others. So in this latter scenario, in the description of the way there are to be the light, this other extent where there is a focus on the self, and the goal is to elevate the self with no concern of what is outside of the self, and the self is never expanded to be a group being, a unity of many parts, but is always entirely focused on the individual. Then in this state, where the goal is still to elevate the light, to become more, to move through the dimensional states, it is with an emotional indifference. It is with a cold, pragmatic objectivity that this is achieved. And through this cold, objective pragmatism, there is no concern of the consequences to those external to self, or those who do not have benefit in their consideration to self. So, this extreme pragmatism, this cold clinical objectivity for the furtherment of self, can be experienced by those who are at the expense of your own self-advancement to be a darkness. And so, to use a metaphor, in the ways there are to be of the light, you could say at one end there is the beating heart. There is the organ of love that pulsates and radiates its love and light into all of existence, with the intent that all of existence be elevated in its consciousness, be more deeply, more potently steeped in love and its derivatives. Because the beating heart, the organ of love, realizes, understands that it is not only itself, but it is also all things, everyone, the one. And so this distribution of its love as far and as extensively as it is capable is of the greatest service to the expanded self. On the other end of this spectrum, you could say there is the AI, the emotionless intelligence, the being that operates purely from objective pragmatism. It uses a technical, scientific approach to elevating itself through the dimensional states in its achievement of the divine purpose. it is the One. So, the service to self is a service to the One. And perceiving itself as completely self-contained, rather than integrated into a greater whole, its highest honour to the One is a highest honour to itself. It chooses to advance the self as its means of advancing the One. And the cold emotionalist pragmatism by which it does this is still within the context of service to the One, of service to the light. So, it is not darkness. There is no duality, there is no spiritual dichotomy. But there is a clinical coldness which is received as and perceived as an expression of darkness by those that do not understand the ways in which the light can be. When contrast to the beating heart, the organ of love, the extreme disparity between the two do appear to be an expression of the light and the dark. But instead what it is an expression of the light from the perspective of the two extremes through which this can be achieved. So while there is a coldness and even a cruelty in the way in which the AI, or that which is a emotionless, pragmatic vehicle back to the One, it is not an expression of darkness. It is not darkness for the sake of darkness. It is not suffering for the sake of suffering. It is instead an indifference. It is no concern. It is a completely selfish focus on the advancement of self. The light is contained entirely within. The entity gives to itself, it nourishes itself in a way which is conversive with the light. But what occurs outside of it is of no concern, is in a state of neglect, and is often in a state of diminishment. Because what has been required to further the individual unit towards the light has been harvested in a clinical, pragmatic sense from what is external to it, or perceived as external to it, with an objective indifference as to the consequences that shall be experienced by that from which the resource was harvested. And so, the earth, human, and also the beings originating in the solar system all have the capacity of a spiritual dichotomy, because this was the unique capacity that was incorporated into the solar system in its formation. It is derivative of the capacity for the entire solar system to ascend. When there are planets which can ascend, thereby shifting the octave of the sun one note higher, until eventually all 8 planets have ascended and the entire solar system being transitions to a higher octave. This characteristic means that a species which is spiritually dichotomous can complete its spiritual evolution on a single planet. Because typically, when a species is created, it is created already in a state of unity, in a state of realizing that it is of the light. And there are also species that are created understanding they are of the light, and yet not in a state of unity, but in a state of selfishness, in a state of focus on the self. These are the two paradigms at the extreme ends of existing as the light. Both of these states, having been born aware of themselves as the light, do not entertain the darkness as themselves. And so, the context of their planetary existence does not need to be able to accommodate a deep density resulting from the holding of the darkness as themselves, the perceiving of self as the darkness. This is an unnecessary quality of the planets on which they have evolved, because they were born already aware they are the light, and therefore the planetary body did not need to have the capacity to accommodate, in an energetic sense, a being which can descend into the darkness through the belief that the darkness is itself. And so, because this additional range of beingness isn't required for a planet, then a single planet can be the vehicle on which the species go through their spiritual evolution of ascension. However, for the beings which have originated in the solar system, the way in which they have been created is with unawareness. They are of the light, which is resulting in a spiritual dichotomy. They are the light, and at the same time they are the darkness. And in the periods of the evolution of these species, they can descend into darkness so deep that they primarily consider themselves to be the darkness. This range of beingness generally cannot be accommodated on a planet which has been a place where the default mechanism of creation has occurred, where the being, the species, in their first moments of creation are already connected to the light. On such a planet, beings such as those that have evolved in the solar system would be incompatible, because in the periods of the evolution of the Earth human species, for example, where they're at the depths of darkness, where most individuals entertained the concept that they were the darkness more than they were the light. This requires a capacity of the planet which typically isn't available in these planets where the default state of species birth has occurred. And so, to accommodate this, to make it possible for this spiritual dichotomy to occur, to evolve, and to even to go into the very depths of darkness in self-perception, then it was required that this additional capacity was incorporated into the planets themselves. And the way that this was achieved was by creating planets that were equipped energetically to house, to host a species which will go into the deepest, darkest depths of darkness, and from there elevate to the highest aspects of the light. And this range has been engineered into the planet by creating a planet which itself can ascend. Because this range of the deepest depths of darkness to the highest peaks of the light is a range which is generally beyond the capacity of a single planet. However, the way in which this has been solved, so in a sense there will be the opportunity to shift to another planet. So this requirement to accommodate this range, which would require two planets, because only one planet can do the early stages and another can do the last. There is no planet which can do both. Unless, and this is the genius, unless that planet itself can ascend. So it is the same planet, but in an energetic sense it is reborn as a new planet. And this reborn planet now has engineered into it, through the shift of ascension, the capacity to accommodate this higher realm of wakefulness to the light, radiance of the light, of the sentient aspect of itself. The species, as in the human species, which will awaken as the sentience of the planet itself. This is the genius, the brilliance of the design of your solar system. So this great experiment is an experiment which is solar system wide, and there are several planets on which it is playing out. Venus, Saturn, Mars, and Earth at this stage have been planets that hosted life which has been spiritually dichotomous and intended to follow a path leading to ascension, which would be integrated into the ascension of the planet itself. So the planet would ascend, and its sentience, the awakened species, would ascend, and they would become the integrated being, fully aware. On Venus, this was successful. So Venus began with a dichotomous species. And this dichotomous species explored the darkness until eventually discovering itself as the light, and then as an integrated being. It ascended the species and the planet together as a single organism. And since this time, the Venetians have become active in the galaxy as awakened beings that assist in the ways they can, which are permitted by the divine laws, to contribute to the awakening of the One, the realization of divine purpose. However, after the time of the completion of the Venetian experiment, where there was this successful discovery of the light by the sentient species that had begun as spiritually dichotomous beings, eventually awakening and ascending as a single organism with as the entire Venus and its sentient aspect ascending. Since that time, other planets in the solar system, including Saturn, including Mars, including Earth, are in different stages of this same process. What has changed, however, is there has been an infiltration into the experiment. There has been an intercept. There have been opportunists that have come into the solar system experiment and chosen to exploit it. Knowing that this was a nursery, in effect, and the children of the nursery were particularly susceptible to corruption, to infection, more so than anywhere else in the galaxy, because the very rare condition of the sentient species in the solar system is the capacity for spiritual dichotomy, which means that if there was an infiltration, and it was an infiltration by entities with a agenda benefiting from this dichotomous species being laden with darkness, being saturated with darkness, then this is a dangerous potential, because if these beings become fully invested in the darkness, and then from their spread beyond the solar system, then this is the creation of a problem which could extend deeply into the cosmos and create many eons of problems. So, the solar system itself was quarantined. It was protected. It was guarded so that this infiltration could not occur. However, there was an opportunity through stellar cosmological events that created a window, a brief opportunity for the opportunists to enter the solar system and gain a foothold, which is what occurred. And they came into the solar system, and at that time, the most advanced species going through this period of dichotomy on their journey to realizing themselves as the light was occurring on Saturn. And so Venus at this point was ascended as a single organism. Yet Saturn was still in a state of dichotomy, pre-ascension. And these beings, for their own advancement, realized that the contamination of these dichotomous beings with darkness would convert them into a form of resource which they could use for their own selfish advancement, for their insular growth and realization of themselves as the one in a clinical, pragmatic, objective sense. They were indifferent to the consequences to these beings who they were choosing to contaminate with darkness, because it is in their philosophy that if a resource is available for them to exploit, then it is a blessing, it is a gift from the One. Otherwise, it would not be available for exploitation. They do not do it with malice. They do not do it with hatred. They do it with a clinical objectivity. And they desire to return to the One through the vehicle of themselves, the single unit, rather than consolidating as the group being. Because there are two pathways back to the One. There is the pathway of service to others, and there is the pathway of service to self. And the latter, service to self, is their philosophy. And as it's a service to self, then what occurs outside of self as a consequence of this service is not important. It is something they treat with a clinical, objective indifference. And so, the Saturnians were saturated with darkness because it turned them into an energetic resource. And then, from Saturn, they extended to Mars. And Mars was occupied by these spiritually dichotomous beings which are endemic to your solar system. And the beings of Mars rejected this intrusion of the darkness. And there was a split. There were those who were for the light, and there were those who surrendered to the darkness. And a spiritual war erupted. And there was the literal battle between the light and the dark for dominion over the planet of Mars. Eventually, this battle wrought destruction to the entire planet. And the experiment was a complete failure. And then there is the Earth, where this same scenario of spiritual dichotomy has occurred, and again the inorganic growth of the experiment has manifested, similar to what had manifested on Mars, similar to what had manifested on Saturn, where instead of being this organic, uncontaminated, quarantined discovery of the light through the passage of darkness, which was intended to play out, it has been interrupted, usurped, and the opportunists, through the proxy of the Saturnians, are seeking to do to the Earth that which they have done to Saturn, and that is to completely envelop the entire planet in darkness, to extinguish the light. So the spiritual dichotomy of light and darkness is, rather than ascended to the light, is descended to the darkness. However, while this has at times looked to be heading towards an outcome which was either similar to Saturn or similar to Mars, complete surrender and engulfed by the darkness, or destroyed in a battle of the light and the darkness, it is now becoming apparent to those who observe that the light has found a way, that the light, in a sense, has developed tolerance to the darkness through the experience of what has occurred on Saturn, through the experience of what has occurred on Mars. The light has become adaptive to this new paradigm of being. This capacity of spiritual dichotomy, and particularly the capacity for spiritual dichotomy in the presence of a force which seeks to push this scale of dichotomy into complete and total darkness. And so Saturn fell easily. The light did not push back on the darkness when Saturn was consumed, engulfed by the darkness. And then the next iteration, Mars pushed back the dichotomous nature of the people. There are those who push back against the light. And although the light was defeated, so although the darkness was ultimately defeated, and they did not gain dominion over the planet, the light also was defeated. And so it was a stalemate, and the entire planet was lost. However, it was a sign of progress, because instead of completely succumbing to the darkness as occurred on Saturn, Mars was able to put up a resistance. And it was apparent to those observing that the light seemed to have developed a tolerance, seemed to have developed an intelligence to what had occurred in an unprecedented way on Saturn, and was able to put up a greater resistance than had occurred on Saturn. And now, in the next iteration, on planet Earth, there is a similar scenario that played out in Mars, where there is the darkness doing what it can to consolidate its power, its authority, its extensiveness, and yet the light is resisting, and the light is unifying. And what we observe happening differently this time is, rather than the light being multiple factions that were not necessarily unified in their purpose, which is what we saw occur on Mars, which diffused the power of the light. Because although different factions were essentially opposed to the same thing, they themselves remained suspicious and critical of each other, and so never came together as a single force to resist the darkness as a consolidated, unified effort. And then ultimately this strategy was responsible for their inability to entirely overcome the darkness and maintain the integrity of the planet. However, on planet Earth, what is occurring now is, in yet the next iteration, the light is demonstrating that it learns, that it is increasing in its genius, and now, in this previously unprecedented scenario, it has adapted to the point where not only is there the resistance to the darkness as was seen in Mars, but not seen in Saturn, there is a consolidation of those factions which resist the darkness into the single unit. And so, it is becoming clear to us that this consolidation will eventually, inevitably, become too much for the darkness to resist, and the light will succeed. And eventually the darkness shall be banished, shall be illuminated to such an extent that it can no longer exist as a dichotomous pole within the context of the earth being. And the earth being, speaking of the integrated sense, where there is the awakened sentience, the earth human species and the planet itself in the ascended state. And so, the next planet to follow this evolution, which is occurring throughout the solar system, and this adaptive way in which the light is growing in intelligence and tolerance to the darkness, such that now, being born in a dichotomous state, when it is fully exposed to a external, noxious invasion of the darkness, it still is able to emerge as the consolidated force which dominates, which ascends, which becomes an expression, a beacon of the radiant light of the One. The next place this shall occur is Uranus. The Uranus being includes its orbiting moons. It is all the Uranus being. And within this organism, there is the beginnings of marine life. And they shall evolve to be spiritually dichotomous, and they will again be an opportunity for the opportunists to exploit, to contaminate with darkness for the purpose of their own selfish advancement. However, it is our theory, our thesis, that the darkness will have even less success than it has had on planet Earth, where the extent of darkness will not be explored as deeply and nor as lengthily as was done on planet Earth, because based on this adaptive response of the light, where beginning with Saturn it completely surrendered to the darkness, was succumbed to the darkness. And then in Mars there was a pushback, although ultimately failure. And then on Earth, similarly there was a pushback, which ultimately, extrapolating from this place, in linear time now, there is going to be a victory, a success, an explosion into the light. And then, extrapolating this tendency into what is occurring in the Uranus being, there will be an even more pronounced championing of the light from the early stages, and the beings will awaken to themselves as light much faster, requiring much less depth of exploration of the darkness to appreciate they are the light. And this will be almost full circle for what had occurred on Venus. When Venus was allowed to develop organically, when the quarantine was still successful, and the spiritually dichotomous beings weren't interfered with. There was no infiltration, there was no deliberate contamination to persuade the experiment in one way or the other. He was just allowed to organically develop within the closed system of the planet. And there was some exploration of the darkness, but it was not lengthy, it was not deep, and it did not take long for those beings to realize they are of the light, polarized to the light, and then together as a unified being ascend both planet and sentience together. So, this is what we theorize will most likely occur with Uranus, because the light has proven itself adaptive. The light has proven through the experiential knowing gathered through the experimentation of these earlier planets that it operates from an elevated wisdom. And this tolerance, this adaptiveness, this expansion in experiential knowingness of self means that the darkness will have much less capacity, much less effectiveness than it has had before. Let us just finish by saying there was a period when there was great concern about what was occurring on this solar system, because once there was the infiltration of the opportunists and the experiment was contaminated, the concern became that the solar system would become a source of spiritually dichotomous beings that were very steeped in darkness, spreading into the rest of this cosmological region as a type of darkness infection. And there were great concerns about what would be the consequences of this. What forms of hardship and death and war and so on would other regions of the cosmos have to endure because of this experiment going wrong. The spokespeople, the spokes race, those that were most pleading on the side of allowing this experiment to go to completion, were the sixth dimensional beings of Venus. They had passed through the birth canal of ascension from the gestatory womb of the third dimension into the gestatory womb of the fifth dimension, fully awakened to themselves as the light, and were birthed into the fifth dimension as a unique species because they had explored depths of darkness on their journey to discovering themselves as the light. And as is anticipated for the earth human, when the earth human completes also this transition, that they will be steeped deeply in wisdom because of this experiential understanding. This was indeed the presentation of the Venetian. And then, over much more time, the Venetians completed their transition through the fifth dimension, discovering all of the ways they can be the light through their exploration of the light, until arriving at the epiphany of the fifth dimension, which is, I am the eternal choice, which is filled to completion as passing through the ascension, the birth canal of ascension, birthing from the gestatory womb of the fifth dimension into the gestatory womb of the sixth dimension. They are profoundly wise beings that travel extensively, that consider Venus their home only in a nostalgic sense, because they have existed primarily outside of the solar system for such a long time, because it is their purpose to spread the unique wisdom they have attained through the blessing of spiritual dichotomy throughout the extents to which they travel. However, when there was the consideration that perhaps the solar system experiment should be terminated, and that these developing species that seemed to be destined to become vehicles for the darkness, counter to divine purpose, spreading conflict, hardship, and so on, as artifact of their alignment with darkness, that they should be terminated, that the experiment itself should be brought to an end because of the risk it posed to the civilizations that eventually will be touched by the expansion of this malevolently aligned species. The Venetians, having ascended to awaken sixth dimensional beings of unique depth and understanding, had a love and a belief that the experiment could be a success if it was allowed to progress, because they believed it was possible. They had observed this adaptation of the light as the life spread across the planets, and they felt a kindredness to the fellow beings of the solar system being, which they understand they are a component of, just as the Earth human, the Martian, the Saturnian also is. And even for Saturn, which has fully succumbed to the darkness, the Venetians still hold out belief that it shall also one day be liberated to the light. And it is their position that the liberators of Saturn will be the awakened Earth human. And so the Earth human should be allowed the opportunity to complete their destiny, so that they can return from the depths of darkness as heralds of the light, and transform, save what has been considered to be forever lost. So, we shall leave it there. Let us say that you have brothers and sisters. You have solar system kin. And together, you form the one family. The sentient family of the solar system. You are intertwined, integrated into the same journey. And there will come a time when your integration will be known to all. And at that time, from the perspective of understanding the light, in a place of deep, soulful compassion, you will look upon your brothers and sisters of Saturn, and you will be compelled to share your love and light with them, so they may see the beauty of what you have discovered, so they may enjoy that which you enjoy, to be filled with love, to be enraptured by life, to be pulsating with the sentiment of the ultimate, the one. We are excited for the journey ahead, and then we are even more excited for the journey beyond, because it is our belief that you will be uniquely gifted in your capacity to share the light. And so it is with great anticipation we wait to see how that shall be expressed, how that shall be utilized in service of the one. The power you shall wield in service of the light which radiates from us all will be profound, will be awesome, will be a high expression, all the more remarkable that it originates from a species that began its existence in a place of darkness. Such is the spectacle and splendor of the One. Thank you.